authoritarianism, heightened repression, or you can add to that, in addition to the heightened repression, conflicts, namely in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. But it has been really, surprising in this context to see over the last kind of 2.5 years, again, these cycles and actually, sustained protests, starting in Sudan, followed by Algeria, then, Iraq and Lebanon, with cycles of protests in Iran as well. And so you are seeing some attempts at democratization from below, but again, whether they will really bear fruit remains to be seen.
Thank you, Shadi. Randy, I'd like to ask you what you think are the signs of democratic decline in the US.
Right. So actually, the way the question is posed assumes that democracy is a linear thing moving forward in history without reversals usually. But democracy is not something that is guaranteed. So as I said before, the signs of decline is when you get widespread protest. So here's how you can look at it. Protests and what we actually call democratic decline is probably not the right characterization. It could very well be that from below, the ideology that has held the system together and justified the inequalities and what have you are actually being called into question. It's just been, in our case here, been triggered by a particular incident, but that incident itself, the killing of George Floyd, is deeply embedded within the society as a whole. Like, race is a long-term structural feature of American society and the political economy as a whole. This is why one killing or a few killings of recent could trigger the type of response that it did. So in contradistinction to call it democratic decline, we also see here a possibility of democratic renewal. That will depend on how the forces of authoritarianism coming from above, to what extent the democratizing social forces from below, how that actually works out. In other words, it's the balance of social forces in the society. And we are right now in a gigantic struggle to really redefine the state, what form the state should take. A privatized personal responsibility state that is supported with a kind of authoritarianism, or a kind of a liberal democratic form of state that has mechanisms of social welfare, the democratization of key institutions of education, of policing, of coercion in general, of the healthcare system. So I don't want to see it as a matter of either decline or not decline, but rather to look at that we're in a moment of conflagration in which some long-term problems are now have come to a head, and they're being sort of, the fight is on, so to speak, to resolve it. Which direction that goes, nobody knows.
I'm going to just do a quick follow-up here. So you talked about the top-down forces. Are there any particular things, one or two things that are really troubling to you that look like they're moving in the authoritarian direction? If so, what are they?
Well, definitely. One in particular is intervention in the judicial system in the United States. With all of its problems, there is still reasonable confidence that the judiciary is reasonably independent. And the case with General Flynn, which is working itself out, is very troubling. The deployment of lethal force against, right in front of the people's house is a troubling sign. It's been widely condemned. There is no doubt about that. The excessive, but I have to say predictable, use of wanton violence against peaceful protesters. It's the difference now, as against say before, is that two things have changed. One is that there's a kind of, if you will, instantaneous documentation of these transgressions. The second is that the demographic composition of the rebellion has changed. So that whereas before it was overwhelmingly the African American population and Latinos who led the charge for democratizing democracy, now a lot of white Americans, especially young ones, have joined in this battle of making things right. I think the discourse that we are a symbol to the world and that we've got it all right and we just need to make it better. I think it's really not holding up. And so, yeah, those are the signs that are there. But I have to say in the same breath, the pushback from social forces from below, I think is equally powerful.
It's good to hear. So I want to move to causality. This is something that international relations scholars are trained from a very early age to think about or point in their career, which is what causes or leads to various things. And in this case, we're talking about democratic decline or a shift in what's been going on. So Cathy, I want to ask you, what conditions do you think need to be in place for this kind of slow erosion of democracy and democratic norms to happen? What needs to be in place for that to happen? And you want to unmute too.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
So I actually think that the decline in confidence in political parties and political leaders is a precondition. I don't think it's democratic decline, but I think it permits democratic decline in that people no longer are defending their institutions, and most dangerously, demagogues who want to assault those institutions are able to gain popular support. And so they campaign on the platform that your leaders and institutions are corrupt, they don't represent you, I represent you. I'm the voice of you, I'm the voice of the people. You know, if you want to have real democracy, you vote for me. Those people who don't support me are the enemies of the people. All the institutions are corrupted by globalists, Jews, serve the interest of dangerous minorities, and I am the people's choice. That seems to me very common in all of these cases. And so what you need to do is prevent that loss of confidence in institutions. Make sure that parties are embedded in the communities they're supposed to represent, that they have, you know, local offices in connection to a rich civil society, and that people feel like they are connected to their representatives. And even, you know, I remember when I was arrested in Chile, and when friends of mine were arrested, including friends in the Communist Party, I could call, and my mother called my local Republican congressman, and he intervened. And that was during Reagan. The Secretary of State intervened under Reagan when I was arrested. So we had a different sense that our local officials were somehow connected to us. What we see before democracy declines is a loss of faith in all of those institutions. That includes the media. We used to have trust in the media when it was a local journalist. It was the journalist we knew the paper. All local media has collapsed. So it's very easy to demonize institutions, parties, media, when they seem really far away from people. And it's very dangerous. So there's ways in which you can, you know, reinvigorate the health of a democracy, preventing that kind of decline.
So Randy, this kind of brings me to something that you had said a little bit earlier about maybe what we're seeing isn't democratic decline, but a question of the inequalities built into the system. Where does populism fit in with the notion of democratic decline? Or in your case, questioning the structures underneath democracy.
Populism needs some kind of a conceptual clarification. I like Thomas Piketty's take on it. I'm reading Capital and Ideology right now, and he says, populism is really when the political parties lose control of the people. I think it's a brilliant kind of way of looking at it, because political parties are part of the hegemonic structure of the state apparatus, right? Especially we see this if we put aside Republicans and Democrats, and you think in terms of the structural power of capital and the way in which political power is constituted in representative institutions. The Democratic Party actually signed on first to raising private money in political campaigns, right? It's the Democratic Party in the United States under Bill Clinton that removed, the firewall that allowed, commercial banks to become investment houses. And there's so many of the crime bill. There's so many things. The reconfiguration of the welfare state under Bill Clinton. All of these things, have contributed to where we are. So it's not only a matter of Republican or Democratic Party. I think we have to go beyond that. Populism, we can look at it in three ways. There's a right-wing populism, which the Jamaicans call it Stuart Hall, developed systematically in talking about examining Margaret Thatcher in the UK in the 1980s. And that authoritarian populism is one of restructuring the relationship between state and civil society, where a kind of personal responsibility, hyper-capitalism based on the Austrian school really begins to define the core values of the society, a kind of a radical individualism. And then there's a left populism, and I understand this to be, there's a Bernie Sanders kind of left populism, which is mostly class-based. But there is another kind of left populism, left democratic populism, which is when you look at the marches over George Floyd or any of these marches, you find not only questions of race or police, people with those kinds of grievances are marching and protesting. It's the people at the end, who are seriously concerned about climate change, about the abuse of minorities, about immigration issues, about rampant racism in the society at large, sort of coming together in a kind of a collective push against the social forces that underpin authoritarianism. So what you've got here is two kinds of populism: a right-wing authoritarian populism and a left democratic populism. And I think these social forces are actually aligned against each other. In a kind of a long term, we are in a pretty much a long-term, maybe a good 20, 25-year kind of conflict to resolve this. Remember, since 1980, when we were told that markets will do the trick and everybody will be happy because all boats will rise. And we found out that instead of that, we have an elephant curve where the 1% at the top are sucking up so much of the benefits of economic growth, and the middle class has basically the living standard has recently collapsed. So what you've got here then is I think we have to go beyond the political parties. We have to look at the longer term kind of rearrangement in which civil society and the state basically understand each other. That's the kind of political negotiation, or if you will, political struggle that we are currently involved in.
Shadi, going off of what Randy said about thinking about populism as the parties and institutions losing control of the people, when we saw the Arab Spring happen, and of course I wasn't there, but I watched it as many people did from their television screens and computer screens, and and was really hopeful when it happened, and thinking of it as a response to authoritarianism. And it, as you noted, only worked in Tunisia. Why do you think that is? And what were the tactics that were successful and not successful, but not just in Tunisia, but in the various countries that experienced that?
Yeah. So, broadly, I would say in terms of lessons, one of the most important overall lessons is the farther down you go, the path of authoritarianism, the harder it is to, reverse course. And so in terms of the United States, I mean, we have had the signs, just daily news that shows that we are kind of experiencing democratic decline. And I've been waiting for the kinds of protests that we witnessed in the Middle East. And, finally, we have something that has the semblance of that kind of ethos and that kind of pushback to the democratic decline. So that's the first thing. I mean, even though in terms of aesthetics, in terms of a lot of the signifiers, there's similarities, and there's a lot of articles now being written about the similarities between the protests in the Arab Spring and protests in the United States, both kind of the ethos of the protest, but also the militaristic response that we saw in even, graffiti art. I mean, there's so much that you can draw parallels to. The United States is very much in a different place than Egypt or many of the other countries that were trying to move authoritarian regimes in the direction of democracy. And so that would be kind of, I think, an important lesson just broadly is, now is the time to try to prevent the slide into authoritarianism in the United States. Why did, places like Egypt not achieve significant gains in terms of authoritarianism, and Tunisia did? I'll compare those two cases briefly. So in Egypt, essentially, after the protests that bring down Hosni Mubarak, you have the military come in and oversee this democratic transition, and there is the moment of unity, euphoria, in Tahrir Square at the time of the uprisings. But it's really what happens after, people go home and clean up Tahrir Square. It's the politics of the transition or of whatever your policy, goal is following the protests. And so we had extreme polarization between Islamists and secular forces in Egypt. The military was never committed, even though it volunteered to oversee the transition, it was never committed to it, obviously, kind of just waited in the background and tried to undermine the process and fan the flames of the polarization as much as it could. And when it got to a point where, it had an opportunity to come and fully dismantle the democratic experiment, it did, basically when the polarization kind of reached its height. And there were actually, the time of what is now called a coup, there was a huge debate about whether what was happening in Egypt was actually a coup or, popular practices of democracy, essentially. There were many people who were unhappy with the Islamist president who was democratically elected, Mohamed Morsi at the time. And so they took the streets to kind of unseat him. And in retrospect, if they had, sat through his term, even though they were unhappy with him, maybe democracy would not have been dismantled in Egypt. There were also a lot of purists amongst the protesters who essentially saw kind of the realm of politics, the political field, as kind of dirty and inherently corrupted and corrupting. And so they wanted to stay in the square and protest rather than, get involved in the politics that they had made possible through their initial protests. And so they were essentially sidelined, and the military and the Islamists kind of took over within the transition. And so in a sense, a lesson for what's happening in the United States is, the moment of protest, there are a lot of people who are showing up to these protests who are there for vastly different reasons and envision change in vastly different ways. And so, once the protests are over and that moment of kind of unity and unified purpose kind of passes, what do you do in terms of, reaching the agenda, and how much compromise from, you've now engaged in kind of calling for principled action, calling for rights and justice and democracy. But, it's always kind of the dilemma for activists is how much are you then going to compromise in order to see that translated into politics, and how much is your agenda going to be co-opted by political figures and the political elite? And I think in Tunisia, they kind of found the right balance. There were actually leaders who were willing, amongst the Islamists and the secular forces, they had a lot of polarization, but they also had, individuals who were willing to compromise. And so they were able to kind of eke out, the transition, and kind of they're on their way to a consolidated democracy, hopefully. It also helped that they didn't have a military that was, that had such entrenched interests and was much more hands-off than Egypt. But I would say those are some of the biggest lessons, is essentially, how much are you going to compromise in terms of the agenda, and how much are you going to, what are the strategies that you're going to use to kind of preserve the integrity of what people were out there for?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Cathy, you spent a lot of time in Chile. What eventually worked there that you think is perhaps transferable here, or maybe it's not, but what worked there?
There are things that are very transferable. I want to just respond a little bit to some of Randy's points, because for me, social movements are an integral part of democracy. Democracy came about because of social movements. Social movements democratized, extended the franchise. Without those social movements, you would not have vibrant democracies. And I was very involved, intimately involved in the resistance movement that toppled Pinochet. And so I would say that, and I will say one more thing about parties. Political parties I don't see them as the way in which the state oppresses the people. I think it's the people's expression. It's the link between civil society and the state. And people I worked for, one friend of mine said, I really care about my wife, but I'm in love with my party. And I worked with party activists in the underground at a time in which parties were illegal. And what we did was reconstruct civil society, social networks from the bottom up. We reconstructed the political parties from the bottom up. And out of that process that took a decade, we were able to finally, when an opportunity emerged, to engage in mass protest. And protesters also had a place to move back into, to hide, to escape when the military, engaged in the worst repression. And I will say the worst repression wasn't just shooting at us, and I was shot at. Two of my very good friends were burnt alive during a protest. Many of my friends were tortured brutally. Another good friend of mine was shot in the neck and died. And I was on a bridge where they shot at us and they killed a young doctor. So those protest movements were really not only did they put a tremendous amount of pressure on the military. General Mattei admitted as much in a discussion with political scientist Alfred Steppen, who he asked for advice, that the military could not continue to defend and delegitimized regime, that it would tear apart the military, obliterate the command structure worse than, he says, Marxism could have done. And it was and he asked Steppen for advice on how to ensure that there was a legitimate plebiscite. And in fact, Steppen said you need to have 13 procedural, you know, I would bring back the 13 procedural guarantees that Chile always had to ensure in a very deeply ideologically diverse party spectrum, that elections were fair. And in fact, the military brought back 10. And when Pinochet tried to ignore the results of the election, called for a blackout, and was about to announce that he won, radio journalists were able to stop Mate on the way to the presidential palace, and ask why there had been a blackout. And Mate said, well, don't you know the opposition won? In which case everybody entered the streets and in, you know, massive celebration, and it was over. Now, what I think the lessons that translate to the United States is this rebuilding from the bottom up. It is something that a Scotch poll noted about, that led to the success of the Tea Party and later Trump, is that large parts of this country, the only civic society or civil society, civic organizations that exist are those influenced by the far right. And that includes shooting clubs organized by the NRA, church groups influenced by the Christian Coalition, organizations set up by Americans, the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity. And she talked about the need to rebuild democratic roots with the Democratic Party, with small d and large d Democrats. And she said what happened, and this is, she predicted 218, is that after the Women's March, people went back to their communities. They didn't just march. And they created new organizations, women's organizations. They were active in directly political organizations like Indivisible, but they were also politicizing sewing groups, other kinds of women's groups, and they got women to run. So all of these new women entered the political sphere. People who had never run for office again, people from every conceivable background, transgender, immigrant, Muslim. We had an election that not only did the Democratic Party sweep in 2018, it brought in the most diverse Congress that we have had. So the transferable lessons is the importance of rebuilding networks of civil society. The difference is Chileans did not have a chance to vote until the plebiscite and then the election after. And I must say, the transferable part about that election is everybody voted for one individual. We all agreed that Patricio Aylwin, even though he was Christian Democrat, even though he was a Christian Democrat that called for the coup, the parties that were in the government toppled by that coup, the communists, the socialists, all agreed that we needed one candidate. We would vote for that one candidate because the most important thing was defeating Pinochet. And I think that lesson is transferable. And the third lesson that's transferable is, even though, rebuild social movements, rebuilding the social fabric of communities is important in both places, Americans have an advantage we did not have in Chile, which is they can vote. And they have to vote. And it's not just agree in terms of a presidential candidate. It's about rebuilding the political system from the bottom up, taking over local offices, state legislatures, governors, as well as Congress and president. And that is really critical to reestablishing democracy in this country.
Thank you, Cathy. So we have some really interesting questions in the chat box. And so I'm going to move on into this part of the talk, although I have a few more questions I might interject myself. So Matthew Jernstedt asked if each of you guys could talk about how COVID-19 has contributed to democratic decline. He says, in countries around the world, leaders with anti-democratic tendencies have used the virus as a pretext to curtail civil rights. And he gives the example of Hungary. Aaron, his last name isn't here, I would say it, also asked, would we have had the huge active demonstrations that we've had in the US today if we did not have COVID-19 to get everyone time off from work and the pent up upset after weeks of isolation. So Randy, I'll start with you and then we can go, you can answer, and then Shadi and then Cathy.
Right. So it does have something to do with political parties. I agree pretty much with everything that Cathy said. But I look at the data, and some of this, is data driven. The Democrats had the White House for 16 years between 1983 and 2013. And in that time, the wealth of Black families declined by 75%. And the wealth of Latino families declined by 50%, whilst the wealth of white families increased by 14%. That's when the Democrats saw it. The Democrats control all three branches of government and failed to pass an anti-lynching bill. That's the Democratic Party. So my measure is not which party is in power, because parties, including the Democratic Party, also, the big multinational companies on Wall Street have enormous inroads into those political parties, as much as and actually countering the democratic social forces that are below. Look at Obama's President Obama's cabinet, and especially his economic advisors. They were Wall Street people, and African Americans have said this repeatedly. When it's election time, everybody goes to their communities, and once it's over, we don't see you again. COVID-19 is a continuation, right? It's not, if you will, a step-level break that has introduced a disjuncture between the life chances of African Americans and the dominant population. It's a continuation of it, largely because of where people work, the kind of work they do, at the front line of services and so on and so forth. They're more exposed. They have less wealth to draw on to pay rent and to pay mortgage and so on and so forth. So just like the Great Recession did, which devastated Black families in the United States, COVID-19 would be a continuation of that devastation. And the figures are already bearing that out. The people who have secure employment, who have annual merit review and so on and so forth, they're doing pretty good, because if you look at the stock market, despite the calamity in the economy as a whole, the stock market is actually doing well. So the established middle classes, who are in part of the supporters of the Democratic Party, Piketty calls them the new Brahmins, because the Democratic Party has become one of the greatest support base is for the highly educated, right? Who actually go and support the Democratic Party. And so you've got, even within the Democratic Party, which is far more democratic than the Republican Party in significant ways, you've still got these unresolved problems. So I don't see COVID-19 as introducing something that is so new. It's simply a continuation of patterns that have been there for a very long time at the structural level within the economy and society.
Shadi, what do you think about this? Do you think COVID-19 has been used by authoritarians to crack down or to consolidate? And also, I love this question from Aaron about the timing, right? That will we be able to have these big protests in many parts of the world because so many people were off work? So Shadi, I'll go to you, then we'll go to Cathy.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it was a sort of a godsend in a sense for some of these authoritarian regimes, particularly where there were, protests had quite a bit of momentum, and protesters had in Iraq and Lebanon and Algeria kind of taking control of the streets. And so it gave, the authorities an excuse to regain control of the streets in a sense. And protesters were trying to find other ways to kind of sustain their movements. But now with kind of this reemergence of, protests with COVID, I think that has, the pendulum has swung in the other direction. There certainly has been a securitized approach to fighting COVID in many parts of the Middle East, as you would imagine. The day off question, I mean, Egypt, it's fascinating because there was this very high profile case of police brutality, someone beaten in daylight, broad daylight, in the middle of the street, beaten to death by police in Alexandria, Egypt, the summer before the uprising in Egypt. And that was a huge kind of catalyst for discontent. And so the first day of the Egyptian uprising was actually the day the government gave everyone off as police day. So it was the day to celebrate the police. So it was, the perfect time to protest this, instance of police brutality. And of course, it wasn't just one instance. So having time off is useful, particularly for people who are, just from the lower socioeconomic classes. The other, just briefly, I want to make is that what's fascinating about the protests now, both in the Middle East, and I'm, heartened to see it here in the United States, is that people are making all sorts of connections. So in a sense, yes, it is about George Floyd, and it is about police brutality, but it's also about, racism is deeply rooted, but it's also about kind of, neoliberal economics. And then there's connections being made in other countries with colonialism. And so there's, it's not being viewed in isolation as this one particular instance, or even this one particular form of, injustice, along the lines of what Randy was saying. And I think that is really kind of very important development that we're seeing.
Thanks, Shadi. Cathy, what do you think? Can you unmute? Yeah.
It's confusing, the muting and unmuting. So I want to respond to the COVID question, but also just dispute something. I read Piketty very differently. Piketty was very active in the campaign for Hamon, who was the elected head of the Socialist Party, not Mélenchon, who was the populist. Piketty is not saying we shouldn't have strong left parties or center left parties. He's saying this left and center left parties became technocratic in the 70s, decided that they had a better solution for managing the economy than their constituents. And they blocked their constituents' voices. They broke their ties to labor movements. And it was that led these parties, absent a base, to these positions that were very damaging to large swaths of the working class. And so he's really making an argument about what the center-left party should do. That is why he was so active in the campaign for the Socialist Party, not because he liked their previous 30 years, but because he believed in their capacity for regeneration. It is very worrisome if after all of these protests, people go home and don't vote, and we have another Trump administration. It is very worrisome if people do not actively engage in making the political parties their own. And COVID, I have, several responses to COVID, especially because I still consider myself a New Yorker, where I did neighborhood organizing around police violence for several decades. Is that on the one hand, I did not expect protests. I thought, boy, we're handicapped by COVID. If we have an authoritarian move, we can't even respond. Everybody's afraid to be in the streets. Really shocked to see people in the streets. On the other hand, I thought there was this incredible pent-up energy for being locked up for 3 months. And that also energized that movement. But it also was atomized. I mean, now it is rebuilding organization, but there was a lot of atomization to that initial wave, which can hurt a movement. Some of the analysis, for instance, of the failure of the Arab Spring outside Tunisia is that in Tunisia, it grew up organically out of the organizations in Tunisia. And in much of the Middle East, it was looking at Tunisia and people taking to the streets without that level of organization. Egypt had the organization, but the critical era was to take to they didn't believe in elections. I argued with leaders of the April 6th movement. I asked them how they were campaigning and organizing for the elections, and they said, no, we're going to hold whoever's elected accountable from the square. And then when they didn't like whoever was accountable, what they did was march and ask the military to remove him. And essentially, they got Mubarak out by asking the military to remove them. So what happens when the military establishes the worst dictatorship in the history of Egypt? When it's the military slaughtering people in the streets, with the military with 40,000 political prisoners, you know, with the military with mass executions and killing of 800 people in a square, what do you do then? And so organization, to me, is local organization is really critical. And I want to, and that has been, you know, decimated by COVID. It's very difficult to do organizing when people were in their homes. Now that we have a mass movement, people are doing it. There's a lot of grassroots organizing going on again.
So we have a question here in the chat box from Rocco about Hungary. I don't know if any of you all feel comfortable to answer this, but he's asking, is the decline in democracy in Hungary reversible? How much does the social, cultural, and even psychological fabric of Hungarian society, based on their history, play into whether democracy is sustainable in Hungary? Does anybody want to take that? Cathy, can you unmute?
It's very difficult. The majority of Hungarians do not support Orban. The system has been rigged. So I believe the last election, the majority, I think it was as much as 60% voted against Orban, but the system's rigged, much like Wisconsin and North Carolina. The system was rigged and gerrymandered in a way that you can win an overwhelming majority and get a minority of seats in Congress. And so what he then did is that he used his parliamentary majority to, you know, eclipse the other institutions of democracy, the courts. He got rid of all of the judges by suddenly doing an age limit, because when the EU, you know, put pressure on him not to simply stack the courts, he came up with a institutional means and another justification. We're simply reinvigorating the courts. We're going to have mandatory retirements for all of these judges, and then he stacked the courts. And so the problem with these declining democracies is that people have to act early. There's a point at which you no longer have the institutions of democracy.
Could the EU do something? I mean, the thing that's interesting to me watching what's happening in Poland, has been happening in Poland as well as Hungary, is what can the EU do? Or should the EU do anything? I mean, because a lot of what's happening there is in contravention to the EU's own rules and regulations. Anybody? Randy, Cathy, Shadi?
Yeah. Well, if you look at EU border control, it's not much more democratic than what's going on in Hungary. It's not only about Hungary; it's throughout Europe. I mean, you know, it's the radical right. I mean, has really sprung up all across Europe, and a lot of it is driven by contradictions of the neoliberal political economy, but also because of that old albatross that's followed Western liberalism throughout this history, and it's called racism, which we refer to, you know, in terms of xenophobia and anti-immigrants and so on and so forth. But it's the old colonial mentality that's coming back to haunt Europe. We intervened in Iraq, and that triggered a lot of that migration that started to go to Europe. The implosion of Syria is not necessarily without any foreign interference. I know a lot of it is, most of it is actually internal. But Hungary is part of a larger dynamic in Europe. And one can actually go beyond Europe, but I think for different reasons. Like in India, where Hindu nationalism, you know, is taken on a very undemocratic path and leading to all sorts of abuses from above and also from below with Hindu nationalism. But my quick answer to the question is that the EU would have to write its own border control policies and its anti-immigration policies before it begins to give advice to Hungary.
But what about, Randy, the things that Poland and Hungary have been doing with their court systems, which it includes immigration, but extends beyond that? What do you think about the EU's ability to intervene there?
Well, you know, the thing is that you've got different kinds of developments in separate countries. I mean, and a lot of it will have to be worked out internally. The EU, these are still sovereign countries, and we tend to forget that, right? There's too much at stake if the EU begins to intervene in each and every country every time it disagrees with what is going on domestically. Sovereignty has raised this ugly head. We all recall when we did international relations theory, you know, like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the European Union was seen as sort of emblematic of where regional integration can go, and how quickly do we have to actually, we are forced actually to revise our ideas about that. Sovereignty will trump regionalism any day, and I think so. There are real limits, to institutional limits, to what regional governance can actually accomplish.
So Cathy, I see you, I think, raising your hand. I want to ask you to do a really quick response to that, because I know you want to respond to that. And then I'd like all of you to, as we close out, say one thing about what you think we need to do right now in the United States. So Cathy, and then Shadi and Randy.
Okay, so Hungary and Poland are part of the EU. They signed agreements in terms of democratic guarantees. To be part of the EU, you are supposed to be a democracy. You are supposed to follow these guarantees. And as a part of the EU, they get a huge amount of funds and money from the EU. So it is very easy and possible for the EU to deny them those funds for violating the basic principles of the EU. Hungary and Poland are also the worst, especially Hungary, in terms of the anti-immigrant violence and the overt racism, especially Hungary. Yes, all of the countries have had horrendous treatment of migrants. Yes, that all has to be addressed. Yes, internally, the attacks on descendants of immigrants as well as immigrants. The police violence, which is very similar to the police violence, you know, African Americans and Latinos experience here. Those have to be addressed. But right now, not only are Hungary and Poland moving towards autocracy, what are they celebrating? The symbols of Nazi Germany. They're marching with, parading with, you know, the symbols of the organization that were collaborators with Nazi Germany. And they're part of the EU. It's really problematic.
Okay, so I'm going to get all of you to give me one thing you think we need to do, civil society needs to do right now in response to some of the authoritarian like moves that we've seen from above in the US. So Cathy, since you're still on, you want to say something really quick, and then we'll go to Shadi and Randy, and then we have to close out.
Right. So I think organize. You should be in your communities. You should be, I mean, COVID makes it really, really hard. But if you're, you know, you should be bringing people together. You should be creating civic organizations, run for office, support local people running for office, and vote.
Thank you, Cathy. Shadi? What do you think?
Right,
Sorry.
so I would say keep broad.
Time.
Let's see, you hear me?
Yep. Oh no, sorry. I think you might. Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, just broadening, keep broadening the focus and making the connections. I mean, I see Cornel West on CNN, you know, mainstream news talking about the link between, you know, what happened in the United States and American imperialism and hegemony abroad. And if there's any gift the Trump administration has given, it's kind of broken all these taboos around, you know, we can now talk about defunding the police, and it's, you know, we can talk about American things that were considered unpatriotic can now be discussed in much more contested ways. The military can be discussed in much more contested ways. So the connections have to, you have to keep making these connections. And if I can make one last quick point, just globally, something that's very interesting to me is the way democracy and human rights has been used to kind of justify a lot of US foreign policies, right? And a certain kind of underlying hierarchy of the United States being more civilized and kind of wanting to spread democracy and human rights in the rest of the world. We've moved very far away from that. Part of that is because of, that's not part of Trump's vocabulary himself. So he doesn't even want to co-opt it. But part of it is just, these episodes, increasingly we see that it's very hard to make that case that there is a huge distinction between the West and the non-West. And I think that's a very important development.
And Randy, you want to finish this?
Right. So I think it's good to actively participate in politics, to go out and vote. But the one thing that I believe really ought to be done is people ought to become bolder in thinking for themselves and don't always follow political parties defining an agenda for you, because they've been part of the problem. We have no alternative really and truly in terms of political organization, but you can think outside of the agenda of political parties and bring that into the political parties rather than just accept the agenda of the Democratic Party or Republican Party and believe that's the end of the world. That's been part of the problem.
So I want to thank all of you for a lively discussion. I feel like we're going to be debating on this after the session ends here. I also want to thank the people in SIS Comms, Kate Arian and Amy Zawada, who in the background kept this running. And also I want to thank the participants. We had a lot of great questions. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We also have another panel this afternoon on the globalization of hate. I'll also be moderating that, and one tomorrow as well on police reform. So if you haven't signed up for those, please do. And again, thank you so much to the panelists and to all the attendees. We really appreciate you coming. Thank you.